So now let's solve genetic probability problems, starting with the problem number 1. According to problem number 1, we have here the presence of the cross between two parents. The first one, it is a pea plant with purple flower in actual possession, which is possessing heterozygous conditions for both. Then another pea plant with white flowers in terminal possession. Now, let's find the genotype and the phenotype of the offspring of this parental generation. Now, if we're going to consider the genotype that is present on the phenotypes that were mentioned earlier, we have here the presence of heterozygous dominant purple flower in actual possession, which is also in heterozygous. Then the other parent, it is now the white terminal possession. So, basically, whenever we are going to adopt this, everything is already stated on your module how we actually come up with the following genotypes, okay? Now, the very first thing that we're actually going to do here is to follow the very first rule, which is known as the FOIL method. Now, when it comes to the FOIL method, it is actually a way of segregating the different characteristics and traits that were presented in this particular type of test cross. So, according to this problem, we have here the presence of two traits. The first trait, it is all about the flower color, and the other trait, it is now about the presence of the position of the flowers. Okay? Now, if you're going to isolate here the different genotypes that is actually present on this following traits, we are actually going to apply this process. So, let's simply start first with the color. So, for the color, we can establish here the presence of the first parent, which is now possessing heterozygous dominant purple flower, while the other parent, it is now possessing white flower. Then, if we are now going to cross the first gene that is present on the genotype of the first parent with the genotype of the first gene of the second parent, then we are going to follow the next part, then the third, and for the fourth. So basically, whenever we are going to consider here the FOIL method, we are actually going to arrive with the following answers. Now, for the very first trait, the segregation that will happen here, we can observe here that the offspring, it would be equivalent to 2 out of 4 heterozygous dominant purple and 2 out of 4, which is homozygous recessive white. We can actually round off the value or the fraction that is present here to 1/2, since 2 out of 4 is also equivalent to 1/2. Okay? Then, from the color trait, which is now the possession of the flower. Now, when it comes to the possession of the flower, we can establish here once again that the first parent is possessing heterozygous dominant axial flower possession, while the other parent, it is now possessing terminal flower possession. Then, doing the FOIL method, we are going to arrive with 2 out of 4 or 1/2 heterozygous dominant axial possession and 1/2 or 2 out of 4 homozygous recessive terminal possession. So this would be the segregation, and that would simply happen right after the FOIL method. Okay? So basically, what we are doing here in this particular point is that we are just segregating here the different possibilities that is present on every single trait. So now, after we are done knowing and segregating the different possibilities that would simply happen on the different trait, let's now proceed with the product method for us to know the genotype and the phenotype of this offspring. So basically, our equation would be just like in this manner, since on the very first level, we already laid here the different segregation that will happen on the genotype that is present on the flower color. Then on the second level, it is now the segregation of the different genotypes that are present on the flower possession. Then we are going to do now the multiplication or the product method, in which we are going to multiply the following. Okay? The very first term that is actually present here on the very first trait would simply be multiplied with the very first term that is present on the second trait. Then, for the second part, we are now going to multiply or do a cross between the very first trait with the second genotype that is present now on the second trait. So now we're going to start by means of copying the genotype that is actually present on the very first term that is present on the very first trait, then the very first term on the second trait. Then we are going to multiply their fractions because 1 times 1 for our numerator would be equivalent to 1, and then 2 times 2, that would now be equivalent to 4. Okay? Then, let's do the second part. Once again, we are going to copy the genotype that is present now on the very first trait. Then, we're going to copy the second genotype that is present on the second trait. Then we're going to multiply the fractions. 1/2 times 1/2, we are going to arrive with 1/4. Okay? So that would be the same process that we are going to do with the remaining genotypes. Once again, we're always going to start with the first layer before going to the second layer. Okay? So, for the second part, we are now going to start with the multiplication of the different values that are present now between the second genotype of the very first trait. We're going to copy this. It is now equivalent to 2 small letter P's or homozygous recessive white. Then, we're going to copy here the one that is present on the first term of the second trait. Heterozygous dominant axial. Then we're going to multiply the different values. 1/2 times 1/2, you are going to arrive with 1/4. Then the remaining part, homozygous recessive white flower and homozygous recessive terminal possession. 1/2 times 1/2, we are going to arrive with 1/4. So basically, that is now the cross that would be present on this particular offspring. So now basically, this is now the summary of the genotypes of the F1 generation or of the offspring of this parent. Now, how about the phenotypes of the F1 generation? Now, for the phenotypes of the F1 generation, we are just going to consider the different phenotypes that is actually present in every single one of them. So, we are just going to write here 1/4 heterozygous dominant purple. So, it would be purple in axial possession. Then, for the second phenotype, it is also 1/4 purple but in terminal possession. Then, for the third, we also have here 1/4, which is now white in axial possession and 1/4 white in terminal possession. And now, if you're going to use percentage and not fraction, 1/4 is also equivalent to 25%. Okay? So we're just going to substitute them with 25% purple axial, 25% purple terminal, 25% white axial, 25% white terminal. Okay, so now let's proceed with the problem number 2. According to problem number 2, it states that a pea possessing a green inflated pod, which is heterozygous for both, with green wrinkled seed is crossed to a pea with yellow constricted pod with yellow round seed, which is heterozygous for both. What is the probability that there will be an offspring with A. Green round seed, B. Yellow constricted pod, C. Green inflated pod with yellow seeds, and D. Green constricted with green round seeds? Now, if we're going to consider the parental generation and their genotypes, we can write them as heterozygous dominant green pod and at the same time heterozygous inflated pod. Then, when it comes to the seed color of the first parent, we can determine here the presence of the green seed and seed. Then, when it comes to the other parent, we have here the presence of yellow pod, constricted pod, yellow heterozygous seed, and round heterozygous seed. Now, if you're going to do the law of independent assortment when it comes to the different characteristics that is actually present on every single trait that is presented in this genotype, we can actually have the following summary. The first one, when it comes to the pod color, once again, we have here the first parent and the second parent, in which it will actually give us the following. 1/2 probability of having heterozygous dominant green pod color, 1/2 possibility of yellow pod color. Then when it comes to the second trait, which is the presence of the pod shape, we can have here the presence of the genotypes of the parents, parent number 1 and parent number 2. Then we have here the probability. 1/2 or simply 2 out of 4 that is heterozygous dominant inflated, and 1/2 or 2 out of 4 homozygous recessive constricted pod. Then when it comes to the seed color, which is now the third trait, we have here the traits of the first parent and the trait of the second parent. So please take note that we are simply doing this since we are going to do now the product method or the simplification of how we can actually solve different problems that is related with genetic probability. With the cross that would be present on the genotype of parent number 1 and parent number 2, we can have here the following probabilities. 2 out of 4 or 1/2 green seed, then 1/2 or 2 out of 4 heterozygous dominant yellow seed. Then let's proceed now to the third trait, the presence of the seed shape. Now, when it comes to the seed shape, we have here the genotypes of the parents. Once again, we are simply doing this since we are considering the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment, that every single one of these traits are present on the different genes that is present on that organism. So it would be passed down in random orders, okay? So we have here the presence of its offspring, the probability that 1/2 would be possessing a genotype of heterozygous round and 1/2 homozygous recessive, which is wrinkled seed. So this is actually the summary of the different things that is actually present in this problem. We have here for letter A, the offspring. It is now possessing the traits of green, round, seed. Okay? Then, if there are actually two types of traits that are actually present here, we are now going to get the probability from the table that we created earlier for us to get the possibility or the probability of the presence and emergence of these different types of offspring with different varied traits. So for instance, for letter A, we have here the presence of green round seed. Then, let's just locate where are the different traits that would actually give us the color green and the round shape when it comes to the seed. So we are actually going to focus on the lower portion. Okay? We can simply observe here that the probability of this couple or of the genotype of the parents to have green seed is equivalent to 1/2. Okay? That is the reason why we are going to write this probability on the lower portion of this certain type of trait. Then, we are going to multiply this with, for the second trait, which is now the presence of round seed. And if we're going to locate here in our table, for the round seed, the probability it is still equivalent to 1/2. Okay? Even though this is considered as heterozygous, this is still considered as a round seed. The phenotype of this organism would still be round. Okay? So it would be equivalent to 1/2. Then, since we are talking about fraction, we are going to multiply them with 100. So basically, 1/2 times 1/2 times 100 would actually give us the probability of 25%. Okay, that is the reason why the answer for number 1, it is equivalent to 25%, since green round seed, it is just equivalent to 1/2 times 1 of probability times 100, which would give us the fraction, which would give us the percentage of 25% probability. For letter B, it states that we are looking for the yellow constricted pod. Okay? So, since we are now going to locate here the different characteristics that are now present on the pod, we are just going to focus on the upper portion. So, it states here, yellow constricted pod. So, the probability that the parents would possess an offspring possessing yellow pod is equivalent to 1/2. Okay, if you are going to locate on the table that you created. So, that would be equivalent to 1/2 yellow pod. Then you're going to multiply this with the probability of possessing a constricted pod, and that is now equivalent to 1/2 also. So 1/2 times 1/2 times 100 would actually give us 25% once again. Okay? Now, for letter C, it is now the presence of the following phenotypes: green, inflated pod with yellow seeds. Okay? So how many traits are actually present now in this case? We now have here the presence of 3 main traits. So let's simply consider the product method by means of multiplying the probabilities of every single one of them. So let's start with the green inflated pod. We have here 1/2 probability. So we're going to have here 1/2. Then multiply it with the inflated pod probability for the offspring. It is equivalent to 1/2 also. Then the third trait, it is now the presence of yellow seed. So the yellow seed is now equivalent to 1/2 probability as well. Then you're going to multiply this with 100, in which you're going to have 1/8 times 100, which is now equivalent to the probability of 12.5%. Okay? So for letter C, it is now equivalent to 12.5% since we multiplied here how many traits? It is equivalent to 3 traits. It is now asking for the probability that the offspring would possess green constricted pod with green round seeds. Okay, so we now have here the presence of 4 traits. Okay, now let's give the probability to every single one of them before we multiply them for us to have the probability for this particular offspring. So, let's start with the green constricted pod. So we can determine here that the presence of the green constricted pod for the pod color, it is equivalent to 1/2. Then we're going to multiply this with the probability that they will possess a constricted pod offspring, which is now equivalent to 1/2 as well. Then, the third trait, green seeds, which is now equivalent to 1/2 as well. Then, lastly, the presence of round seeds, the probability is now equivalent to 1/2 as well. Then, we're going to multiply this with 100. So, we have here the presence of 1/2 times 2 times 2 times 2 would give us 16 times 100, which will now give us the answer of 6.25%. Okay, so now let's proceed with problem number 3. According to problem number 3, free earlobes and clockwise whirl of hair on the back of the head are dominant to attached lobes and counterclockwise whirl respectively. A husband and wife know their genotypes to be heterozygous dominant for the presence of the free earlobes and heterozygous dominant when it comes to the presence of the clockwise whirl. Then, the partner, it is now the presence of homozygous recessive for the attached earlobe and heterozygous dominant for the presence of clockwise whirl. Now, what would be the probability that they will have an offspring with A. Free earlobes and clockwise whirl, B. Free earlobes and counterclockwise whirl, and C. Both recessive traits or simply the presence of attached earlobe and counterclockwise whirl. So, you know the drill on what we are going to do even though this is now the presence of the different characteristics among humans. The very first thing that you're going to consider here is to do the segregation of the different traits that are present. So remember, we have the presence of the first trait, it is now the presence of the earlobes and the presence of the whirl. So, if we're going to isolate now the different genotypes that are present on the earlobes, we can have here the presence of heterozygous dominant and homozygous recessive, which would give us a probability of 1/2 the presence of free earlobes and 1/2 the presence of attached earlobes. So basically, 2 out of 4 is still accepted, but I am just rounding off those terms for you not to be somewhat confused when it comes to the problem solving that we are going to do on the latter part of this discussion, okay? But still, 2 out of 4 is still accepted. We're still going to arrive with the same answer since we are utilizing here the percentage, okay? Now, for the second trait, it is now the presence of the whirl, in which we can actually say that both parents are possessing na heterozygous dominant for the presence of the clockwise swirl, then we are actually going to have here the following traits. The first one, we have the presence of 1/4 homozygous dominant clockwise swirl, 1/2 or 2 out of 4 heterozygous dominant clockwise swirl, and 1/4 homozygous recessive counterclockwise swirl. Since the ones that are actually present on the problem are all phenotypes, we can now actually combine the different traits which are now possessing the same phenotype. Okay? So even though they are possessing not the same genotype, but on the problem, it states here the specific phenotype, we're now going to focus on the phenotype. Okay? You're going to combine those terms, you're going to combine those values for us to have the final value for the same phenotype even though they are possessing different genotypes. Okay, so that's the thing when it comes to these problems. According to letter A, what would now be the probability that your offspring would possess 3 earlobes, okay, and the presence of clockwise whirl? Okay, so the presence of 3 earlobes and clockwise whirl. Now, we are going to consult once again the table that we created when it comes to the segregation and the independent assortment. So for the free earlobe, it is now the presence of 1/2 probability. Then we're going to multiply this with the clockwise whirl probability that is equivalent to 3/4. Okay? Please take note, it is not 1/4 plus 1/2 only, but rather we are going to combine them since we are talking about the presence of the specific phenotype. So that would now be equivalent to 3 out of 4. Then do not forget to multiply this with 100, in which we're going to arrive with the answer that is equivalent to 3 out of 8 times 100, which would give us the probability that would be equivalent to 37.5%. Okay, so this would be our answer for letter A. Now, for letter B. For letter B, it states here the presence of 3 earlobes and the presence of counterclockwise whirl. Okay? So we can now determine here the presence of the free earlobe that is equivalent to 1/2 probability. Then we're going to multiply this with counterclockwise whirl that is equivalent to 1/4 probability. Then we're going to multiply this with 100. Okay? Which would actually give us 1 out of 8 times 100. That would also be equivalent to 12.5%. So please take note, you can always check your answers when it comes to the problems that I am actually doing here in this board. Okay, if you think that some parts of this computation is quite questionable, you can actually redo it and check your own solution. And you can just consult me if you think there are some problems or concerns when it comes to the computation. Okay, and lastly, let's now proceed with letter C. For letter C, it is now the presence of both recessive traits. So once again, what are the different recessive alleles that are present on the earlobe and the whirl? For the earlobe, it is now the presence of the attached earlobe. And when it comes to the whirl, it is now the presence of counterclockwise. For the attached whirl, it is equivalent to 1/2 probability. Then we're going to multiply this with clockwise whirl. We're going to multiply this with counterclockwise whirl probability that is now equivalent to 1/4. Then we're going to multiply this with 100, and just like what we had on letter B, we're going to arrive with the answer of 1/8 times 100, which is now equivalent to 12.5%.